They called her Canvas during military police training, thinking her gentle hands were better suited for painting watercolors than handling weapons. What they didn't understand was that behind those artist's fingers lay the steady nerves of someone who would become the most feared security specialist the 82nd Airborne had ever produced. When the brass told her she'd never see real combat action because her psychological profile showed excessive empathy for civilian populations, she simply nodded and continued practicing at the firing range until her pistol groupings were tighter than anyone else's rifle shots. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the mountains surrounding the village of Krasny Bor as Elena Vasquez stepped out of her small apartment above the art supply store. Her breath formed small clouds in the crisp Romanian air as she walked down the cobblestone street toward the community center where she taught painting classes to local children. At 28, Elena possessed the kind of quiet beauty that made people think of Renaissance portraits, with dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding beyond her years. Her long black hair was usually pulled back in a practical bun, and she favored flowing scarves and comfortable sweaters that gave her the appearance of someone who lived entirely in the world of creativity and artistic expression. The village children adored their American art teacher, who had arrived 3 years ago speaking broken Romanian, but carrying supplies that transformed their community center into a vibrant studio filled with easels, brushes, and canvases. Elena had learned their language quickly, her natural ear for linguistic patterns serving her well as she integrated into the mountain community that had welcomed her with the cautious warmth reserved for outsiders, who proved their worth through consistent presence and genuine care. What the villagers didn't know was that Elena Vasquez had chosen this remote location specifically because it was far from military installations, conflict zones, and anything that might remind her of the 6 years she'd spent as a military police officer specializing in high-risk security operations. Her gentle demeanor with the children mask training that had made her legendary among personnel who dealt with the most dangerous situations the military encountered. She'd been the specialist they called when diplomatic security required someone who could blend into civilian populations while maintaining lethal effectiveness if situations deteriorated. The community center was already filled with excited chatter when Elena arrived for her morning class. 12 children between the ages of 8 and 15 were setting up their easels, with the careful attention she'd taught them, preparing to work on landscape paintings that captured the dramatic beauty of their mountain homeland. Elena moved among them with patient encouragement, offering gentle guidance on brush techniques and color mixing while her eyes automatically conducted the same threat assessment that had become second nature during her military years. Exit routes identified and memorized. Potential defensive positions cataloged and evaluated. The location of every adult in the building noted and tracked. Old habits from a life she'd worked hard to leave behind, carried forward into a world where the most dangerous thing she expected to face was an accidentally overturned paint jar or a minor disagreement about artistic interpretation. Her morning class was interrupted by the arrival of Father Dimitri, the village priest whose weathered face usually carried the serene expression of someone at peace with his place in the world. Today, however, his features showed the kind of worry that came from receiving news that threatened everything he held dear. Elena noticed immediately the way his hands trembled slightly as he approached her workspace, the careful glances he cast toward the children, and the underlying tension in his voice when he asked to speak with her privately. They stepped outside the community center, where Father Dimitri looked up at the mountains that surrounded their peaceful valley with an expression Elena recognized from her military experience, the look of someone who knew danger was approaching, but hoped it might somehow pass by without touching the people under his protection. "Elena, I've received troubling news from contacts in Bucharest," Father Dmitri said quietly, his English carrying the formal precision of someone who'd learned the language through careful study rather than casual conversation. There are reports of armed groups moving through the region, claiming to be conducting security operations against terrorist elements. Elena felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had always preceded mission briefings during her military career. The automatic shift from civilian mindset to tactical thinking that she'd worked for 3 years to suppress. What kind of armed groups? The priest hesitated, clearly struggling with how much information to share with someone he knew as a gentle art teacher rather than someone with experience in security matters. Military units, according to the reports, but not Romanian military. Foreign operators claiming authority under international security protocols that no one seems able to verify. Elena's mind immediately began processing the implications, drawing on intelligence briefing patterns she'd memorized during her years of active duty. Unauthorized military operations in civilian areas typically indicated either rogue elements operating without official sanction or legitimate units conducting missions that required plausible deniability. Neither possibility suggested good outcomes for isolated mountain villages populated by civilians who had no involvement in international conflicts. Have these groups made contact with local authorities? Elena asked, her voice maintaining the calm concern appropriate for a civilian while her mind calculated defensive possibilities and evacuation routes. Father Dmitri shook his head, his expression growing more troubled. That's what concerns our regional contacts. Normal military operations would coordinate with local government officials and police commanders. These groups appear to be avoiding official channels entirely, which suggests their presence here isn't authorized by any legitimate authority. Elena looked back toward the community center, where she could hear her students laughing as they worked on their paintings, completely unaware that their peaceful world might be about to change dramatically. The sound triggered protective instincts she'd developed during her military service, the automatic response of someone trained to stand between civilians and the violence that threatened them. "Father, what exactly are you asking me to do?" Elena said carefully, recognizing that her response to this conversation would determine whether she could maintain the peaceful life she'd built or whether circumstances would force her back into the world she'd worked so hard to leave behind. The priest studied her face with the perceptive attention of someone accustomed to reading the hearts and minds of his parishioners. "I've noticed things about you, Elena. The way you move through spaces, always aware of your surroundings. The way you position yourself in rooms to observe everyone present. The physical conditioning that's unusual for someone whose only exercise should be walking between art classes." Elena felt her carefully constructed cover beginning to unravel under the observation of someone who'd spent decades learning to see beyond surface appearances. She'd been careful to maintain her artistic persona, but apparently not careful enough to completely suppress the reflexes and awareness patterns that marked her as someone with specialized training. "I'm not sure what you think you've observed," Elena replied, making one final attempt to maintain the fiction that had protected her for 3 years. Father Dmitri smiled gently, the expression of someone who understood more than he typically revealed. "Elena, I spent 2 years as a military chaplain before taking orders in civilian ministry. I've counseled enough soldiers to recognize someone who's carrying the weight of experiences that don't fit with teaching children to paint landscapes." The priest's words hung in the mountain air between them, loaded with implications that could change everything about Elena's carefully constructed new life. She looked at the community center, where her students were probably wondering why their teacher had stepped outside during class time, then at the mountains that had provided 3 years of peace and safety. "What kind of help do you think I could provide?" Elena asked quietly, knowing that her answer would determine whether she could continue pretending to be nothing more than an art teacher, or whether circumstances would force her to become something else entirely. "Our village has no military presence, no police station, and no means of defending ourselves if these armed groups decide we represent some kind of threat or opportunity. Father Dmitri paused, choosing his words carefully. But if someone with appropriate experience were willing to help organize basic security measures, we might have options beyond simply hoping these groups pass us by. Elena understood what he was really asking. Her psychological profile during military service had noted her exceptional ability to organize civilian populations for their own protection while maintaining the kind of calm leadership that prevented panic in dangerous situations. She'd been the specialist they sent to diplomatic compounds and humanitarian facilities that needed security enhancement without obvious military presence. Father, organizing security measures would require revealing capabilities that might raise questions about my background, Elena said, testing whether the priest was prepared for the implications of what he was requesting. Some backgrounds are revealed when circumstances require it, he replied. The question is whether you're willing to help people who've welcomed you into their community and grown to love you as family. Elena looked back at the community center one more time, hearing the voices of children who'd never experienced real violence or understood that their peaceful existence depended on others being willing to face dangerous situations on their behalf. She thought about Maria, the 10-year-old whose paintings showed remarkable talent for capturing light and shadow. About Alexandru, the teenager who'd initially resisted art classes but now spent hours working on detailed pencil portraits. About the elderly women who attended her evening watercolor sessions and shared stories about their families while learning to express themselves through color and brushwork. Tell me about the timeline, Elena said, making the choice that would transform her from art teacher back into the security specialist she'd once been. Reports suggest these groups are systematically moving through mountain communities, conducting what they call population assessments. They've been in our region for approximately 1 week, but haven't reached our specific valley yet. Elena felt the familiar weight of operational planning, the moment when abstract concerns became concrete mission, parameters that required immediate decision-making and resource allocation. Assessment teams typically precede larger operations by 24 to 48 hours, she said, drawing on intelligence patterns she'd learned during her military career. If they're conducting systematic population assessments, they're probably gathering information for follow-up operations that will require different capabilities and personnel. Father Dmitri nodded, his expression showing relief that Elena understood the tactical implications better than he'd dared hope. That matches what our contacts have reported. The assessment teams ask questions about population size, local leadership, available resources, and potential security threats. Elena's mind immediately began processing the defensive implications, calculating how a small mountain village could protect itself against organized military units while maintaining plausible deniability about the source of their security preparations. The key would be utilizing the natural advantages of mountainous terrain, while organizing civilian population in ways that maximized their safety without obviously revealing military-level planning. Asterisk. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Father, I need you to understand something important, Elena said, her voice carrying the serious tone that marked the transition from civilian teacher to security professional. If I help organize village defenses, and if these armed groups represent the kind of threat I think they do, the situation could escalate to levels of violence that would permanently change this community. The priest met her gaze directly, his expression showing the kind of moral certainty that came from years of ministering to people in difficult circumstances. Elena, these people have built lives here based on the belief that peaceful existence is possible in a world that often seems committed to violence. If someone is coming to threaten that peace, then perhaps it's time for someone who understands violence to stand between them and the people who've chosen a different path. Elena felt the weight of old commitments stirring to consciousness. The promises she'd made during her military service about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. She'd joined the military police not because she enjoyed conflict, but because she believed someone needed to stand guard so that others could pursue lives devoted to creation rather than destruction. I'll need complete honesty from community leadership about available resources and personnel, Elena said, accepting the responsibility that would require her to become someone she'd hoped never to be again. And I'll need everyone to understand that once we begin security preparations, there's no pretending these measures are anything other than preparation for potential combat. Father Dmitri smiled with evident relief, the expression of someone who'd found the answer to prayers he'd been afraid to voice. Elena, I believe you were brought to our community for exactly this purpose. Your artistic gifts have enriched our children's lives, but perhaps your other gifts were meant to preserve those lives when they come under threat. They returned to the community center, where Elena's students had continued working on their landscape paintings with the focused concentration she'd taught them. The children looked up expectantly when she entered, their faces showing the trust and affection that had developed over 3 years of patient instruction and genuine care for their artistic development. Elena moved among them, offering encouragement and technical guidance while her mind shifted into the planning mode that had made her effective during military operations. She was simultaneously the gentle art teacher they knew and loved, and the security specialist who was already calculating how to transform their peaceful mountain village into something that could withstand whatever threat was approaching from the world beyond their valley. The afternoon brought a meeting with village leadership in the community center after art classes had concluded for the day. Elena found herself facing a dozen adults who represented the various aspects of their small community. Farmers who worked the terraced fields carved into the mountainside, shop owners who provided essential goods and services, teachers from the village school, and elderly residents whose families had lived in these mountains for generations. Father Dmitri had clearly prepared them for the revelation that their American art teacher possessed capabilities beyond artistic instruction. But Elena could see the mixture of confusion and concern in their faces as they tried to reconcile the gentle woman they knew with someone who claimed expertise in security matters. Elena stood before them, her artistic scarves and paint-stained apron creating an almost surreal contrast with the serious military assessment she was about to provide. She'd never before been in a situation where she needed to transition so completely from civilian cover to operational authority, while maintaining the trust and cooperation of people who knew her only in her peaceful role. My name is Elena Vasquez, and for the past 3 years, I've been honored to be part of your community as your art teacher, she began, her voice carrying the calm authority that had served her during military briefings. But before I came here, I spent 6 years as a military police specialist with the United States Army, with specific training in civilian population security and defensive operations. The room was quiet except for the sound of mountain wind moving through the trees outside. Elena could see the processing happening in their faces as they adjusted their understanding of someone they'd thought they knew completely. Father Dmitri has informed me about reports of unauthorized armed groups operating in our region, Elena continued. Based on my military experience, I believe these reports represent a serious threat to our community's safety and security. I'm prepared to help organize defensive measures, but I need everyone to understand what that means and what risks we'll be accepting. Georgi Popescu, who owned the village's largest farm and served as unofficial community coordinator, leaned forward in his chair with the practical concern of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected multiple families. Elena, what kind of defensive measures are we discussing? And what level of threat are we preparing to face? Elena had prepared for exactly this question, knowing that civilian leadership needed honest assessment of risks and capabilities before committing their community to actions that could have life or death consequences. Based on the operational patterns Father Dmitri described, We're likely facing professional military units conducting unauthorized operations in civilian areas, Elena replied. This could range from intelligence gathering to resource acquisition, to elimination of perceived threats. Our defensive preparations need to assume the worst-case scenario while hoping for something less dangerous. Ana Moldovan, who taught at the village school and had 3 young children, raised her hand with the careful concern of someone whose maternal instincts were focused on protecting the most vulnerable members of their community. If we organize defenses, does that make us targets for retaliation? Would we be safer if we simply cooperated with whatever these groups want? Elena had encountered similar questions during her military service when working with civilian populations who faced impossible choices between resistance and compliance. Her answer drew on both tactical knowledge and understanding of human psychology under extreme stress. Ana, cooperation only works if the approaching forces have legitimate authority and benevolent intentions toward civilian populations. Elena said gently, unauthorized military operations typically indicate either rogue elements or sanctioned missions that require plausible deniability. Neither scenario suggests that cooperation will guarantee safety for your families. The weight of that assessment settled over the room like a physical presence. Elena could see the moment when abstract concerns became personal fears for specific individuals they loved and were responsible for protecting. What advantages do we have? Asked Stefan Radu, a man in his 50s who operated the village's small mechanical repair shop and had the practical mindset of someone who solved problems by understanding available resources and limitations. Elena smiled for the first time during the meeting, recognizing the shift from fearful uncertainty to practical planning that indicated a community was ready to take responsibility for its own survival. We have several significant advantages, she replied, moving to the community center's wall map that showed their valley and the surrounding mountain terrain. First, defensive geography. This valley has limited access points that can be monitored and defended by small numbers of personnel. Second, local knowledge. You understand this terrain better than any outside force could learn quickly. Third, community cohesion. You trust each other and communicate effectively, which are crucial capabilities during dangerous situations. Elena paused, studying the faces around her and seeing the gradual transformation from worried civilians to people who were beginning to believe they might have options beyond passive acceptance of whatever approached from outside their peaceful valley. Most importantly, she continued, we have the advantage of preparation time. If we act quickly and intelligently, we can establish defensive positions and communication networks before any hostile forces arrive in our area. Father Dmitri, who had remained quiet during most of the discussion, spoke up with the moral authority that made him the community's spiritual leader. Elena, what exactly are you proposing? What would our defensive preparations look like? Elena had spent the afternoon developing a security plan that utilized their geographical advantages while acknowledging the limitations of civilian personnel who lacked military training. Her proposal balanced effectiveness with practicality, creating layers of defense that could be implemented by people whose primary experience involved farming, teaching, and operating small businesses. We establish observation posts at the 3 main access points to our valley, Elena began, pointing to locations on the map where the mountain roads converge toward their village. These positions provide early warning of approaching vehicles or personnel, giving us time to implement defensive measures before threats reach our community center. The plan continued with communication protocols, evacuation routes for non-combatants, and defensive positions that utilized natural terrain features while providing protection for personnel who would be responsible for implementing whatever resistance became necessary. Elena looked around the room, seeing the mixture of determination and fear that marked civilians who were accepting responsibility for defending their own lives and community. She'd seen similar expressions during her military service when working with diplomatic personnel and humanitarian workers who found themselves in situations that required courage beyond their normal experience. I need everyone to understand that once we begin these preparations, we're committing to resistance if these approaching forces represent a genuine threat to our community, Elena said quietly. There will be no going back to pretending we're simply a peaceful mountain village with no means of defending ourselves. The silence that followed her words carried the weight of a decision that would define their community's character and determine the fate of everyone present. Elena waited, knowing that this choice had to come from them rather than being imposed by someone with military experience, but no permanent stake in their shared future. Georgi Popescu was the first to speak, his voice carrying the steady authority of someone who'd spent decades making difficult decisions that affected multiple families. Elena, 3 years ago, you came to our community as someone seeking peace after serving your country. You've given our children gifts of creativity and beauty they wouldn't have received otherwise. If you believe these defensive measures are necessary to protect those same children, then you have our support. One by one, the other community leaders voiced similar commitments, their words carrying the weight of people who understood they were choosing to risk everything rather than accept whatever fate others might impose upon them. Elena felt the familiar responsibility of someone who'd been entrusted with lives that depended on her knowledge, experience, and judgment. As the meeting concluded, Elena realized that the peaceful life she'd built over the past 3 years was ending. Tomorrow she would begin transforming their mountain village into something that could withstand whatever approached from the dangerous world beyond their valley. The art teacher would remain, continuing to nurture creativity and beauty in young minds, but she would also become something else, the guardian who stood between her adopted community and the violence that threatened to destroy everything they'd built together. That evening, Elena returned to her apartment above the art supply store and opened a wooden box she hadn't touched in 3 years. Inside, carefully wrapped in cloth that still smelled faintly of gun oil, was the Beretta M9 pistol. That had been her constant companion during 6 years of military service. The weapon felt familiar in her hands, its weight and balance as natural as holding a paintbrush, though serving a very different purpose in the creation of safety rather than art. She spent an hour cleaning and inspecting the pistol, her hands moving through maintenance procedures with the automatic competency that came from thousands of hours of training and practice. Tomorrow she would begin teaching the people she'd grown to love as family how to survive in a world that had suddenly become much more dangerous than the peaceful existence they'd known. Elena looked out her window at the mountains that surrounded their valley, seeing them now not just as sources of artistic inspiration, but as defensive positions that might determine whether her students would survive to continue creating beauty in a world that often seemed determined to destroy it. The woman they'd called too gentle for combat was about to discover whether 3 years of peace had diminished the capabilities that had once made her legendary among personnel who faced the most dangerous situations the military encountered. Dawn broke gray and cold over Krasny Bor as Elena made her way through the village streets, noting how the familiar landscape had transformed overnight in her tactical awareness. Every doorway now represented potential cover, every roofline a possible observation position, every narrow alley between stone houses a defensive choke point that could channel approaching threats into predetermined killing zones. The peaceful mountain village where she'd taught children to paint for 3 years had become a battlefield in her mind, mapped and measured according to principles she'd hoped never to use again. Stefan Radu was waiting at the mechanical shop with the equipment Elena had requested the previous evening. Binoculars salvaged from hunting gear, handheld radios purchased from the electronics store in the larger town 20 kilometers away, and coils of rope that would be essential for establishing secure communication lines between observation posts. His weathered face showed the determination of someone who'd spent the night processing the reality that their peaceful existence was about to be tested by forces beyond their control. "Elena, I've been thinking about the observation posts you described," Stefan said, spreading a detailed topographical map across his workbench. "My brother-in-law operates a logging camp near the eastern approach. He knows those mountain paths better than anyone, and he's willing to help with early warning duties." Elena studied the map, calculating sight lines and communication distances, while factoring in the physical limitations of civilians who lacked military training and surveillance techniques. The eastern approach was the most vulnerable access point to their valley, a winding mountain road that provided multiple concealed positions for approaching vehicles while offering limited visibility for defensive observation. "How reliable is your brother-in-law under stress?" Elena asked, her question carrying the weight of someone who understood that early warning systems were only effective if the personnel operating them maintained discipline when faced with genuine danger. Mihai spent 2 years as a border guard before the government reorganizations, Stefan replied. He's seen armed smugglers and dealt with situations that required keeping calm while reporting threats to higher authorities. Not military experience, but better than most civilians. Elena nodded, recognizing that they would need to work with available personnel regardless of their limitations. Military-level training was a luxury they couldn't afford given their timeline and circumstances. What mattered was establishing a network of reliable people who could provide accurate information when their community's survival depended on knowing what approached from beyond their protected valley. The morning was spent establishing the first observation post, a concealed position carved into the rocky outcropping that commanded views of the eastern approach road for nearly 3 kilometers. Elena worked alongside Mihai and Stefan, using techniques learned during her military service to create a hide that would be invisible to casual observation, while providing clear fields of view for surveillance equipment. Mihai proved to be competent and careful, his movements showing the disciplined patience of someone accustomed to long hours of watchful waiting. As they positioned the radio equipment and tested communication protocols, Elena found herself cautiously optimistic about their ability to establish effective early warning capabilities, despite the rushed timeline and civilian personnel. The communication test went smoothly, with clear radio contact between the observation post and the community center where Ana Moldovan had volunteered to coordinate information flow during emergency situations. Elena had chosen Ana specifically because her teaching experience made her skilled at managing multiple sources of information while maintaining calm authority during stressful circumstances. By midday, they had established 2 functional observation posts covering the primary access routes to their valley. The third position, monitoring the seldom-used mountain trail that hunters and hikers occasionally use to reach their area, would require additional equipment and personnel that Elena hoped to have in place before evening. As they returned to the village center, Elena noticed the subtle changes that marked a community preparing for potential conflict. Conversations were quieter and more serious. Children played closer to their homes rather than wandering freely through the streets. Adults moved with the purposeful efficiency of people who had tasks that couldn't be delayed or ignored. Father Dmitri approached as Elena completed her equipment check near the community center. His expression carried the complex mixture of gratitude and concern that marked someone who understood the necessity of defensive preparations while hoping they would prove unnecessary. "Elena, I've received additional information from my contacts in Bucharest," the priest said quietly, glancing around to ensure their conversation wouldn't be overheard by villagers who were already dealing with sufficient stress. "The armed groups operating in our region are being described as counterterrorism specialists conducting population security assessments." Elena felt the familiar chill that came with intelligence updates that confirmed her worst tactical assessments. Counterterrorism operations in civilian areas typically indicated either legitimate security responses to genuine threats or cover stories for activities that required plausible justification for international observers. What kind of population security assessments? Elena asked, though her military experience suggested she already knew the answer. Father Dmitri hesitated, clearly struggling with how much alarming information to share with someone who was already carrying responsibility for their community's survival. According to the reports, these specialists are identifying potential insurgent sympathizers and eliminating security threats before they can organize resistance to legitimate government. Operations. The euphemistic language was familiar to Elena from intelligence briefings that described operations where civilian casualties were inevitable but needed to be presented in terms that allowed for official deniability. Population security assessments typically meant systematic interrogation followed by elimination of anyone whose loyalty to established authority structures seemed questionable. Father, how much time do we have? Elena asked, her voice carrying the tactical urgency of someone who understood that their defensive preparations might need to accelerate beyond what civilian personnel could reasonably manage. The priest consulted notes written in his careful handwriting, his expression growing more troubled as he reviewed the information he'd received. These specialists completed operations in the Vulcan Mountains 2 days ago. They're moving systematically through communities in our region, spending approximately 18 to 24 hours in each location before proceeding to the next target area. Elena calculated distances and travel times, factoring in mountain road conditions and the methodical pace that characterized professional military operations. Their valley would likely be reached within the next 36 hours, possibly sooner if the specialists encountered no significant delays or complications during their current activities. The timeline compression forced immediate decisions about defensive priorities and resource allocation. Elena had hoped for additional days to complete training and position preparation, but circumstances were requiring acceleration of plans that had assumed more generous preparation time. Father, I need to speak with the community leadership immediately, Elena said, her tone carrying the command authority that marked the transition from planning to immediate operational necessity. We're moving to accelerated defensive posture. As of this moment, within an hour, the village's key personnel had assembled in the community center, where Elena spread her tactical maps across the tables, usually used for art classes and community meetings. The contrast between her military planning materials and the colorful paintings created by her students served as a stark reminder of how completely their circumstances had changed. The specialists conducting population security assessments will reach our area within 36 hours, Elena announced without preliminary discussion. This means we need to complete defensive preparations immediately and be ready to implement emergency protocols by tomorrow evening at the latest. Georgi Popescu leaned over the maps, his farmer's practical eye assessing the defensive positions Elena had marked around their valley perimeter. Elena, you're asking us to transform from peaceful villagers to something approaching soldiers in less than 2 days. Is that realistic given our capabilities and experience? Elena met his gaze directly, knowing that her answer would determine whether they maintained unity during the critical hours ahead or fragmented under pressure that exceeded their psychological preparation for genuine danger. Georgi, you won't become soldiers in 36 hours, Elena replied honestly. But you can become people who refuse to be victimized without resistance. Sometimes that's enough to survive when professional forces expect easy compliance from civilian populations. Anna Moldovan raised the concern that Elena had been anticipating since learning about the compressed timeline. My children and the other young ones in our community, where will they be safest if these specialists decide our village represents some kind of threat? Elena had spent considerable time developing evacuation protocols that balanced child safety with the practical limitations of mountain terrain and civilian transportation capabilities. Her plan utilized the natural cave systems in the upper valley, positions that provided protection while maintaining communication with defensive positions around the village proper. The children and elderly residents will be moved to prepared positions in the cave complex above the village, Elena explained, pointing to locations on her topographical map. These positions are supplied with food, water, and communication equipment. Most importantly, they're accessible only through paths that can be defended by small numbers of personnel. Stefan Radu had been studying the defensive positions Elena had marked around the village perimeter, his mechanical expertise allowing him to understand the engineering aspects of her fortification plans. Elena, the positions you've selected provide good defensive advantages, but they also commit us to fighting rather than negotiating or surrendering if these specialists offer those options. The observation forced Elena to address the fundamental question that every defensive operation required civilian personnel to answer before committing to resistance rather than compliance. Her response drew on both military experience and understanding of the psychological factors that determined whether people fought effectively when their survival depended on combat performance. Stefan, negotiation and surrender are only viable options if the approaching forces have legitimate authority and benevolent intentions toward civilian populations, Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd witnessed the consequences of both resistance and compliance during her military service. Based on the operational patterns we're seeing, neither assumption seems warranted. The afternoon was dedicated to rapid implementation of defensive measures that had been planned for more leisurely execution over several days. Elena found herself simultaneously coordinating multiple activities while providing individual instruction to villagers whose survival would depend on their ability to implement procedures they'd never practiced under genuine combat conditions. Mihai and Stefan worked to establish the final observation post while maintaining radio contact with positions already monitoring the eastern and southern approaches to their valley. Their reports indicated normal traffic patterns with no unusual military activity visible from their concealed surveillance positions. Anna Moldovan organized the evacuation supplies and communication protocols that would allow non-combatant personnel to remain informed about defensive operations while staying clear of direct engagement areas. Her teaching experience proved invaluable for managing the complex logistics of moving families with children to prepared positions that balanced safety with practical necessities. Father Dmitri coordinated with community members who lived in outlying farms and houses, ensuring that everyone understood the timeline for movement to defensive positions and the communication signals that would indicate different levels of threat response. As evening approached, Elena conducted a final inspection of their hastily prepared defensive network. The observation posts were functional and properly concealed, manned by personnel who understood their responsibilities and communication protocols. The evacuation routes had been tested and supplied with necessary equipment. The defensive positions around the village provided overlapping fields of fire that would allow small numbers of riflemen to engage superior forces from protected positions. Most importantly, the community had transformed from a collection of worried individuals to a coordinated unit whose members understood their roles and trusted the leadership that would guide their decisions during the dangerous hours ahead. Elena returned to her apartment as darkness settled over the mountain valley, knowing that this might be her final night of peaceful sleep for an unknown period. She cleaned her pistol once more, checking every component with the thorough attention that had kept her alive during previous combat operations. The weapon represented her primary capability for protecting people who had become family during 3 years of shared community life. The radio beside her bed crackled softly with periodic check-ins from the observation posts, confirming that their early warning network remained functional and alert. Elena listened to the familiar voices of people she'd grown to care about deeply, now taking turns standing guard through the night to protect everyone they loved from threats approaching from the dangerous world beyond their peaceful valley. At approximately midnight, Mihai's voice came through the radio with the controlled tension that indicated genuine concern rather than routine communication. Elena immediately recognized the shift in his tone and reached for the radio with full attention to whatever information he was about to report. Community Center, this is Eastern Observation. Mihai transmitted using the communication protocols Elena had established for maintaining operational security. I'm observing unusual activity. On the approach road, multiple vehicles traveling without normal lighting, moving slower than civilian traffic patterns. Elena was fully alert within seconds, her mind shifting into the tactical analysis mode that had served her during military operations where accurate threat assessment meant the difference between successful mission completion and catastrophic failure. Eastern Observation, how many vehicles and what type? Elena transmitted, already calculating response options based on different possible scenarios. At least 3 vehicles, possibly 4, Mihai replied. Appear to be military-style trucks or transport vehicles based on size and movement characteristics. Currently approximately 8 kilometers from village perimeter, moving steadily in our direction. Elena felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded combat operations, the physiological response of someone whose body understood that survival would soon depend on split-second decisions and precise execution of plans that had been rehearsed, but never tested under genuine life-or-death conditions. All stations, this is command. Elena transmitted to the entire communication network. Implement alert status immediately. All personnel to assigned positions. Evacuation protocols begin. Now. Within minutes, the village transformed from sleeping community to coordinated defensive operation. Families moved quickly and quietly toward evacuation positions, while designated personnel took up defensive positions around the village perimeter. Elena could hear the organized activity through her windows, the sound of people implementing plans they'd hoped never to use. Elena gathered her equipment and moved toward the command position she'd established near the community center, a location that provided communication with all observation posts while offering protected sight lines to the main areas of the village. Her pistol was holstered but readily accessible, 13 rounds in the magazine plus 2 spare magazines carrying additional ammunition. The Eastern Observation Post reported continued vehicle movement in their direction, with estimated arrival at the village perimeter within 20 to 30 minutes. The approaching vehicles maintained tactical spacing and light discipline that confirmed Elena's assessment that they were dealing with professional military operators rather than civilian authorities or random criminal elements. Ana Moldovan's voice came through the radio from the evacuation coordination position. REPORTIN. G that all families with children had successfully reached the protected cave positions and were maintaining communication readiness for further instructions. The efficiency of the evacuation process gave Elena confidence that their preparations had been adequate despite the compressed timeline. Father Dmitri checked in from the Southern Observation Post, confirming no unusual activity from his position but maintaining alert status as requested. Stefan reported similar conditions from the western approach, indicating that the approaching threat was concentrated along the eastern axis route rather than representing a coordinated multi-directional assault. Elena positioned herself at a command post with clear views of the eastern approach road and radio contact with all defensive positions. Her role would be to coordinate response to whatever the approaching vehicles represented, making tactical decisions based on the actions and apparent intentions of the unknown personnel who were about to enter their protected valley. The sound of diesel engines became audible as the vehicles approached the village outskirts, their engines running with the steady efficiency of well-maintained military equipment. Elena could see headlights through the trees, confirming Mihai's report about multiple vehicles moving in coordinated formation toward their community. Through her binoculars, Elena observed 3 military-style trucks entering the village along the main road, their occupants wearing uniform clothing and carrying automatic weapons with the casual competence of professional soldiers. The lead vehicle stopped near the community center while the other trucks positioned themselves to block potential escape routes from the village center. Elena counted approximately 12 personnel total, all carrying automatic weapons and moving. With the disciplined coordination that indicated extensive training in civilian population control operations, their commander appeared to be conducting radio communication with external authorities, suggesting that this operation was part of larger coordinated activities in the region. The specialist who appeared to be in command approached the community center with two subordinates, his weapon held in ready position while maintaining the kind of tactical awareness that indicated extensive combat experience. Elena could see through her binoculars that he was scanning the village for signs of resistance or defensive preparations. Elena made the decision that would determine whether their community survived the next hour through successful deception, or whether circumstances would require the kind of violent resistance that would permanently change the character of their peaceful mountain village. She stepped out of her concealed position with her hands visible but not raised, presenting herself as a concerned civilian rather than someone with military capabilities. "Good evening," Elena called out in English, deliberately choosing a language that would identify her as a foreign resident rather than a local villager who might be considered a security threat by personnel conducting population assessments. The commander turned toward her with immediate attention, his weapon shifting to ready position while his subordinates flanked to provide covering fire if the situation required aggressive response. Elena noted their professional positioning and tactical discipline, confirming her assessment that they were dealing with experienced military personnel rather than paramilitary groups with limited training. "You are American," the commander stated in accented English, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to civilian compliance with military directives. "What is your purpose in this area?" Elena recognized the critical moment when her response would determine whether their defensive preparations remained hidden or whether the situation escalated to open conflict that would test every capability she'd developed during her military service. "I'm an art teacher," Elena replied, maintaining the civilian persona that had protected her for 3 years while calculating the positions of all visible personnel and identifying potential cover if the situation deteriorated. "I've been living here for 3 years, teaching children painting and helping with community education programs." The commander studied her appearance, clearly noting the contradiction between her obvious American background and her presence in a remote Romanian mountain village that had no apparent connection to international interests or strategic importance. "Art teacher," he repeated, his voice carrying skepticism about her explanation. "You are alone in this village?" "No other foreign personnel or international organization representatives." Elena felt the tactical situation balancing on the edge of violence or peaceful resolution, knowing that her next words would determine whether the approaching confrontation could be managed through deception or whether circumstances would force her to become the combat specialist she'd hoped never to be again. "Just me," Elena said calmly, aware that her answer was about to be tested by personnel whose survival depended on identifying threats that might be concealed among civilian populations. The commander's radio crackled with an incoming transmission in a language Elena didn't immediately recognize, but the tone carried the urgency of someone reporting unexpected developments. As he responded to the communication, Elena noticed his subordinates shifting positions with the subtle movements that indicated preparation for potential combat rather than continued questioning of a civilian art teacher. The radio conversation concluded with what sounded like new orders, and the commander's expression hardened as he turned his attention back to Elena with renewed focus. His weapon remained in ready position while his eyes conducted the kind of systematic assessment that suggested he was no longer accepting her civilian cover story at face value. "Miss Teacher," the commander said, his English carrying a coldness that hadn't been present during their initial exchange. We have received information that suggests this village may be harboring personnel with military training who represent potential security threats to our operations in this region. Elena felt the familiar tightness in her chest that preceded combat situations where survival depended on split-second decisions made with incomplete information. The tactical situation was deteriorating exactly as she'd feared, with their defensive preparations about to be tested by personnel whose professional competence exceeded what she'd hoped they might encounter. "I'm not sure what kind of information you could have received," Elena replied carefully, maintaining her civilian demeanor while calculating distances to available cover and cataloging the positions of all visible hostile personnel. "This is a peaceful farming community with no military connections or political activities." The commander smiled without warmth, an expression that suggested he'd heard similar denials from other civilian populations who'd attempted to conceal capabilities that his unit had been trained to identify and eliminate. He gestured to one of his subordinates, who immediately began moving toward the houses where villagers lived, his automatic weapon held in assault position. "Perhaps we conduct search to verify your claims about peaceful farming community," the commander announced. Sometimes security threats are hidden among populations that appear harmless to casual observation. Elena realized that the moment for deception had passed, and that circumstances were about to require capabilities she'd spent 3 years trying to leave behind. The systematic search of village homes would immediately reveal the communication, equipment, defensive supplies, and coordinated absence of civilian personnel that would confirm the presence of organized resistance preparations. "Commander," Elena said, her voice carrying a subtle shift in tone that reflected the transition from civilian teacher to someone with military experience. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of our community and the kind of threat assessment that's appropriate for this situation." The change in her demeanor was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of professional bearing that trained personnel recognized immediately as indicating capabilities beyond civilian norms. The commander's response was immediate and decisive, his weapon shifting to direct targeting position while he signaled his subordinates to assume combat formation. "You are not art teacher," the commander stated with certainty. "Your posture, your situational awareness, your language patterns indicate military training. We are trained to recognize such deceptions." Elena felt the last vestiges of her peaceful cover dissolving under the scrutiny of personnel whose survival had depended on identifying exactly the kind of threat she represented. The moment had arrived when she would need to become the combat specialist she'd once been, using capabilities she'd hoped never to employ again in defense of people who'd become her chosen family. "No," Elena said quietly, her hand moving with practiced smoothness toward the pistol concealed beneath her civilian clothing. "I'm not just an art teacher." The engagement began with the kind of explosive violence that characterized close-quarters combat between trained personnel, where survival measured in fractions of seconds and victory belonged to whoever combined superior skill with tactical awareness of environmental advantages. Elena's draw was faster than the commander's reaction time, her Beretta M9 clearing its holster and acquiring target in a single fluid motion that spoke of thousands of hours of practice and previous combat experience. Her first shot struck the commander's center mass before his automatic weapon could complete its swing toward firing position. The two subordinates responded with professional competence, immediately seeking cover while attempting to establish overlapping fields of fire that would eliminate the unexpected threat. But Elena was already moving, using the terrain features and architectural elements she'd memorized during 3 years of unconscious tactical assessment. Elena's second and third shots eliminated the nearest hostile personnel while she transitioned to cover behind the stone wall that surrounded the community center courtyard. The engagement was unfolding exactly as her military training had prepared her to handle, with superior individual marksmanship compensating for disadvantages in numbers and automatic weapons capability. The remaining personnel from the military vehicles were responding to the sound of gunfire with disciplined efficiency, deploying from their transport positions to establish the kind of coordinated assault that would overwhelm individual resistance through superior firepower and tactical coordination. Elena counted 9 additional hostiles moving to engage her position, their automatic weapons and professional teamwork representing odds that would normally require either withdrawal or massive defensive advantages to overcome successfully. But withdrawal would expose the evacuation positions where her community's families were sheltering, and her defensive advantages were limited to superior knowledge of local terrain and the element of surprise that was rapidly diminishing. Radio clipped to her belt crackled with Mihai's voice from the Eastern Observation Post, his transmission carrying the controlled urgency of someone reporting developments that would affect tactical decision-making. Command, I observe additional vehicles approaching from the Eastern Access Road. At least 2 more trucks with estimated personnel count of 15 to 20 additional hostiles. Elena felt the tactical mathematics shifting dramatically against survival odds, but her response was immediate and decisive. The approaching reinforcements would arrive within minutes, creating overwhelming numerical superiority that would make successful defense impossible through conventional tactical approaches. All stations, Elena transmitted while engaging 2 hostiles who were attempting to flank her position through the village's narrow streets. Implement emergency protocols immediately. Community safety depends on preventing hostile access to evacuation positions. Elena's pistol work was precise and devastating, each shot placed with the accuracy that had made her legendary during her military service. She moved between cover positions with fluid efficiency, using architectural features and terrain advantages to negate the numerical superiority of personnel, whose automatic weapons required clear sight lines to be effective. The sound of additional diesel engines announced the arrival of reinforcements, their tactical deployment immediately recognizable as the coordinated assault pattern used by professional military units to overwhelm defensive positions through superior numbers and firepower concentration. Elena realized that conventional defensive tactics would be insufficient against the force now converging on their village, and that survival would require the kind of audacious individual action that military doctrine discouraged but desperate circumstances sometimes demanded. Stefan's voice came through the radio from his position near the mechanical shop, his transmission carrying information that would determine Elena's tactical options for the next critical minutes. Elena, I can create diversion using fuel storage and electrical systems. Might provide cover for movement toward evacuation routes. Elena understood immediately what Stefan was proposing, a coordinated destruction of village infrastructure that would create confusion and concealment while potentially eliminating multiple hostile personnel through carefully timed explosions and electrical fires. Stefan, execute diversion on my signal. Elena transmitted while calculating the timing required to coordinate her individual combat actions with Stefan's sabotage activities. All other personnel maintain evacuation security and prepare for immediate withdrawal if positions become compromised. Elena moved through the village streets with the tactical awareness that had kept her alive during previous combat operations, using shadows and architectural cover to avoid detection while positioning herself for maximum effectiveness when Stefan's diversion created opportunity for decisive action. The approaching personnel were deploying with professional competence, their movements indicating extensive training in village clearing operations and civilian population control. Elena counted 23 hostiles total, equipped with automatic weapons and tactical gear that suggested capabilities far exceeding what would normally be required for population assessment activities. Through her tactical assessment, Elena realized that these weren't counter-terrorism specialists conducting routine security operations, but elimination specialists whose mission involved removing potential threats rather than gathering intelligence or establishing control over civilian populations. The radio crackled with Elena Moldovan's voice from the evacuation coordination position, her transmission carrying the maternal authority that had made her effective at managing the community's most vulnerable members during crisis situations. Elena, all families are secure in protected positions, but we're receiving reports of movement near the upper valley approaches. They may be attempting to locate our evacuation sites. Elena felt the tactical situation reaching critical mass, with hostile forces converging on both her defensive position and the locations where her community's families were sheltering. The moment had arrived for the kind of individual action that would either succeed completely or fail catastrophically, with no middle ground for partial success. "Stefan, implement diversion now," Elena transmitted while moving toward the position. That would provide optimal engagement angles when the confusion began. The explosion from Stefan's mechanical shop was immediate and devastating, sending flames and debris across the village center while simultaneously destroying the electrical distribution system that provided lighting for hostile personnel who were conducting night operations in unfamiliar terrain. Elena used the confusion to engage multiple targets with rapid precision, her pistol shots eliminating personnel who were temporarily disoriented by the unexpected destruction of their tactical advantage. The darkness created by electrical system failure favored individual operators with superior local knowledge over coordinated units that depended on communication and mutual support. Within 90 seconds, Elena had eliminated 8 additional hostiles while moving through terrain she knew intimately toward positions that would allow continued engagement of the remaining personnel. Her ammunition count was decreasing rapidly, but her tactical effectiveness remained high due to superior marksmanship and environmental advantages. The remaining hostile personnel were adapting to the changed circumstances with professional competence, using portable lighting and communication equipment to re-establish coordination while advancing toward Elena's last known position. Their movements indicated training specifically designed for countering individual operators who used terrain advantages and superior marksmanship to offset numerical disadvantages. Elena realized that her ammunition would be exhausted before she could eliminate all remaining threats through direct engagement, and that tactical success would require a different approach that utilized psychological pressure and terrain advantages, rather than depending entirely on superior shooting capability. Mihai's voice crackled through the radio with intelligence that would determine Elena's options for the next critical phase of the engagement. "Elena, the Eastern Observation Post reports that the remaining personnel are establishing communication with external headquarters, possibly requesting additional reinforcements or extraction support." Elena understood that time was becoming a critical factor, with the possibility that air support or additional ground units might be dispatched to assist the personnel who were discovering that their routine population assessment had encountered unexpected and deadly resistance. Elena transmitted to the evacuation coordinator. "Prepare for immediate withdrawal to secondary positions if current defensive operations fail to eliminate remaining threats. Family safety takes priority over all other considerations." Elena moved through the darkened village toward the position where the remaining hostile personnel were attempting to re-establish tactical coordination, her approach utilizing stealth techniques that had served her during previous combat operations, where survival depended on approaching superior forces without detection. Through her night vision assessment, Elena could see 7 remaining personnel attempting to organize coordinated assault on her suspected position while maintaining communication with external authorities about the unexpected resistance they were encountering from what should have been a defenseless civilian population. Elena's approach brought her within pistol range of the hostile command position, where their leader was conducting radio communication that would likely bring additional forces to their location within hours. The tactical situation required immediate resolution before reinforcements could arrive, and make successful defense impossible through overwhelming numerical superiority. Elena's final engagement was swift and decisive, her remaining ammunition used with surgical precision to eliminate the command element while the remaining personnel were focused on coordination activities rather than perimeter security. The engagement concluded within seconds, leaving the village quiet except for the sound of flames consuming Stefan's mechanical shop and the distant echo of her final pistol shots. The radio silence that followed confirmed what Elena's tactical assessment had already determined through direct observation. The immediate threat to her community had been eliminated through individual action that had overcome overwhelming numerical odds through superior skill, tactical awareness, and intimate knowledge of local terrain advantages. Stefan's voice broke the silence with the calm satisfaction of someone whose contribution had proved decisive during critical moments. Elena, the diversion was successful, and all hostile personnel appear to be neutralized. Damage to village infrastructure is manageable and can be repaired once security situation is resolved. Elena holstered her empty pistol and activated her radio to address the entire community network with the information they'd been waiting to receive since the engagement began. All stations, this is command. Immediate threat has been eliminated. Maintain security protocols until dawn, then begin normal evacuation return procedures. Ana Moldovan's response carried the relief and gratitude of someone whose primary concern had been protecting the children and families who'd been sheltering in cave positions, while Elena fought to ensure their safety. Elena, all families are secure and unharmed. The children have been asking about their art teacher and whether painting classes will resume tomorrow. Elena smiled for the first time since the engagement began, recognizing in Ana's words the determination of a community that refused to allow violence to destroy the peaceful existence they'd built together in their mountain valley. The reference to painting classes was both practical question and symbolic statement about their commitment to maintaining normal life, despite the extraordinary circumstances they'd just survived. Father Dimitri's voice joined the radio network with the moral authority that had guided their community through the most dangerous night of their collective existence. Elena, what you accomplished tonight will be remembered as the moment when our community learned that peaceful people can defend themselves when circumstances require courage beyond normal experience. Elena began moving through the village to assess damage and confirm that all hostile personnel had been eliminated, her tactical sweep revealing the extent of the engagement that had just concluded. 23 professional military operators had been neutralized by individual action, supported by community coordination, and Stefan's perfectly timed diversion. The tactical success was complete, but Elena understood that their long-term security would depend on measures beyond individual combat capability. The elimination of an entire specialist unit would trigger investigation and possibly retaliation from authorities who'd authorized the original population assessment operation. As dawn approached, Elena gathered the community leadership in the Waco, damaged but functional community center to address the strategic implications of their tactical victory. The immediate threat had been eliminated, but their actions would have consequences that extended beyond their isolated mountain valley. Georgi Popescu was the first to voice the concerns that everyone present understood, but had been reluctant to articulate during the immediate aftermath of their successful defense. Elena, what happened last night will not remain secret. Authorities will investigate the disappearance of military personnel and the destruction of equipment that belongs to official operations. Elena had been considering exactly those implications since the engagement concluded, drawing on her understanding of military bureaucracy and operational security protocols to assess their options for maintaining long-term safety despite having eliminated personnel who'd been conducting officially sanctioned activities. The specialists who came here last night were operating under cover stories that provided plausible Deniability for their actual mission, Elena explained. Their elimination can be attributed to conflicts with local criminal elements or territorial disputes between competing authority structures. Official investigation will be limited by the same requirements for deniability that authorized their original presence. Aina Moldovan raised the practical concern that would determine whether their community could return to normal existence or whether they'd be forced to relocate to avoid retaliation from authorities who might not accept official explanations for the loss of trained personnel. Elena, can we remain here safely, or do we need to evacuate permanently to avoid future threats from people who want revenge for what happened last night? Elena studied the faces around her, seeing people who'd proven their courage and commitment to protecting each other, but who deserved honest assessment of the risks they would face by choosing to remain in their mountain village rather than abandoning the life they'd built together. The operational security that protected the specialists also protects us, Elena replied. Their mission required plausible deniability, which means official acknowledgement of their elimination would compromise the authorities who authorized their presence. We're safer here than we would be anywhere else, as long as we maintain operational discretion about what actually happened. Father Dmitri nodded with understanding, born of experience in navigating complex political situations where truth was less important than maintaining stability and avoiding consequences that served no one's interests. Elena, our community has learned something important about itself during the past 24 hours, the priest said quietly. We've discovered that peaceful people can become something else when circumstances require protecting what we value most. That knowledge changes us, but it also makes us stronger and more capable of maintaining the peace we cherish. Elena felt the weight of transition from combat specialist back to art teacher, knowing that her role in the community had fundamentally changed, even as her commitment to nurturing creativity and beauty in young minds remained unchanged. She would continue teaching children to paint landscapes and express themselves through color and form, but she would do so with the knowledge that she'd proven capable of protecting their right to pursue such peaceful activities. The days that followed brought gradual return to normal routines, tempered by increased appreciation for the safety and stability that had been threatened but successfully defended. Elena resumed her art classes with students who understood that their teacher had protected them from dangers they were too young to fully comprehend, but old enough to recognize as genuine threats to their families and community. Stefan's mechanical shop was rebuilt with improvements that reflected lessons learned during their defensive operations, including communication equipment and emergency supplies that would be available if future circumstances required similar coordination and preparedness. The observation posts were maintained with volunteer rotations that provided early warning capabilities while allowing normal farming and business activities to continue without obvious security measures that might attract unwanted attention from authorities or criminal elements. Elena's empty pistol was cleaned, reloaded, and returned to the wooden box in her apartment, where it would remain available but hopefully unused for the remainder of her time in the mountain village that had become her true home. The weapon had served its purpose, protecting people she loved from forces that would have destroyed their peaceful existence without hesitation or remorse. 6 months later, Elena stood before her advanced painting class, demonstrating watercolor techniques for capturing the subtle light that illuminated their mountain valley during early morning hours. Her students worked with focused concentration, their brushstrokes showing improvement that reflected months of patient instruction and genuine artistic development. The children who'd sheltered in cave positions during the night when their community was threatened were now creating beautiful representations of the landscape that surrounded their homes, their artwork expressing appreciation for peace and safety that had been defended by someone who understood the value of both creation and protection. Elena looked out the window at the mountains that provided both inspiration for artistic expression and defensive advantages that had enabled successful resistance against overwhelming odds. The village continued its peaceful existence, but with deeper understanding of the courage and capability that ordinary people could demonstrate when circumstances required extraordinary responses to protect what mattered most. The woman they'd underestimated because of her gentle appearance and artistic sensibilities had proven that true strength often developed in unexpected forms, and that the most effective guardians were sometimes those who understood both the beauty worth protecting and the price that protection sometimes required. Elena smiled as she watched her students creating works of art that celebrated the peace their community had fought to preserve, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to nurture creativity while remaining prepared to defend the safety that made such pursuits possible. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, delivered by a government courier who waited patiently while Elena signed for the official correspondence that bore the seal of the Romanian Ministry of Internal Affairs. Her students were working quietly on their latest project, a series of portraits depicting family members, when Elena opened the envelope and found herself reading words that threatened to unravel the peaceful existence her community had rebuilt over the past 8 months. Elena Vasquez was requested to appear for questioning regarding her knowledge of events that had occurred in Krasny Bor during the previous winter, specifically related to the disappearance of personnel conducting authorized security operations in the region. The language was bureaucratic and carefully neutral, but Elena recognized the underlying threat immediately. Someone had connected her to the elimination of the specialists, despite the operational security measures that should have protected both her identity and her community's involvement. She folded the letter carefully and continued circulating among her students, offering encouragement and technical guidance while her mind processed the implications of official attention that could destroy everything her community had worked to preserve. The children's artwork showed remarkable improvement over the months since their defensive operations, their brushwork displaying confidence and technical skill that reflected the security they felt in their mountain village. Maria, now 11 years old, was working on a portrait of her grandmother with the kind of patient attention to detail that marked genuine artistic dedication. Her painting captured not just physical features, but something deeper about character and experience, the kind of emotional truth that Elena had spent years teaching her students to recognize and express. "Miss Elena," Maria said quietly, looking up from her easel with the perceptive intelligence that had made her Elena's most promising student, "is everything all right? You seem worried about something." Elena managed a reassuring smile while calculating how much time she might have before official investigators arrived in their village to conduct the kind of systematic inquiry that would expose the defensive preparations and community coordination that had enabled their successful resistance. "Everything is fine, Maria," Elena replied, adjusting the girl's brush angle to help her achieve the skin tone she was attempting to capture. "Sometimes adults receive letters that require attention to bureaucratic matters that aren't very interesting but need to be handled properly." After class concluded and her students had cleaned their supplies and departed for their afternoon activities, Elena walked to the community center where she knew she would find Father Dmitri preparing for evening services. The priest had maintained his role as moral anchor for their community throughout the months since their defensive operations, helping people process the psychological impact of having participated in lethal combat while preserving their commitment to peaceful existence. Father Dmitri looked up from his sermon notes when Elena entered, immediately recognizing in her expression the kind of serious concern that indicated developments requiring community attention and coordinated response. "Elena, you have news that affects our situation," the priest observed, setting aside his religious preparations to focus entirely on whatever information she was about to share. Elena handed him the official letter, watching his face as he read the formal language that requested her cooperation with ongoing investigations into events that officially had never occurred. Father Dimitri's expression remained calm, but she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes as he assessed the implications for everyone in their community. This inquiry could expose our defensive preparations and the elimination of personnel who were conducting authorized operations, Father Dimitri said quietly after finishing the letter. How do we respond to official attention that threatens to criminalize actions we took to protect our families? Elena had been considering exactly that question since opening the envelope, drawing on her military experience with situations where official investigations threatened to expose operations that had been necessary but couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The investigation creates risks for everyone who participated in our defensive operations, Elena replied. But it also creates opportunities if we respond with coordinated information management rather than individual attempts to avoid responsibility. Father Dimitri understood immediately what Elena was suggesting, recognizing the strategy of presenting unified narrative that protected individual participants while acknowledging community actions in terms that avoided criminal liability. You're proposing that we control the investigation by providing information that satisfies official requirements while protecting operational details that could implicate specific individuals, the priest said. Elena nodded, appreciating Father Dimitri's quick grasp of tactics that balanced cooperation with authorities against protection of people who'd risked their lives to defend their community. The approach required careful coordination and absolute consistency among everyone who might be questioned about events from the previous winter. We need to meet with community leadership immediately, Elena said. Everyone needs to understand the situation and agree on information protocols before any official investigators arrive in our village. Within 2 hours, the core leadership group had assembled in the community center where Elena spread the official correspondence across the table and explained the situation that threatened their collective security. Georgi Popescu, Ana Moldovan, and Stefan Radu listened with the focused attention of people who understood that their responses would determine whether their community survived official scrutiny without criminal prosecution. The investigation represents recognition that something significant occurred here during the winter, Elena began. Our challenge is providing sufficient information to satisfy official curiosity while avoiding details that could result in criminal charges against individuals who participated in defensive operations. Stefan studied the official letterhead with the practical concern of someone who'd spent months repairing and improving village infrastructure after their defensive operations. His mechanical expertise had been crucial during their resistance, but it also made him vulnerable to charges related to the explosions and infrastructure damage that had been essential for their tactical success. Elena, what level of information are we prepared to acknowledge? Stefan asked. Do we admit to organized resistance, or do we maintain that defensive actions were spontaneous responses to threats against our families? Elena had anticipated exactly that question, recognizing that their information strategy would need to balance official requirements for cooperation against the need to protect individuals from criminal prosecution related to their defensive activities. We acknowledge that our community took defensive measures when threatened by unauthorized personnel who represented dangers to civilian safety, Elena replied. We maintain that our actions were protective rather than aggressive, and that any casualties resulted from efforts to defend families rather than eliminate official personnel. Ana Moldovan raised the concern that had been troubling Elena since receiving the official inquiry, the question of whether their information strategy would protect the children and elderly residents who'd been evacuated to cave positions during their defensive operations. Elena, if investigators question community members individually, will everyone be able to maintain consistent stories about what happened and who was responsible for specific actions? She asked. Elena recognized the challenge immediately, understanding that successful information management required not just coordinated narratives but also Psychological preparation for official questioning that might become intensive and intimidating. We prepare everyone with clear, simple, and truthful information that focuses on family protection rather than tactical operations, Elena said. Children and elderly residents were evacuated for safety. Adults took defensive positions to protect. Evacuation sites. Individual actions were coordinated through community leadership rather than military-style command structures. Father Dmitry nodded approvingly, recognizing the approach that emphasized civilian self-defense, rather than military operations that could be characterized as insurgent activity or resistance to legitimate authority. The narrative protects individual participants while acknowledging community coordination for defensive purposes, the priest observed. It presents our actions as family protection rather than organized resistance to official operations. Elena spent the remainder of the week conducting informal preparation sessions with community members, helping them understand the information protocols that would protect everyone during official questioning, while maintaining truthful responses that couldn't be characterized as deceptive or obstructionist. The process revealed how much their community had changed during the months since their defensive operations. People who'd once been primarily concerned with farming, teaching, and small business operations now demonstrated understanding of operational security and coordinated information management that reflected their shared experience during genuinely dangerous circumstances. Mihai proved particularly adept at understanding the balance between truthful cooperation and operational security, his experience as a former border guard helping him appreciate the official perspective while maintaining commitment to protecting community members who trusted him with their safety. The investigators arrived on a cold morning in December, 3 officials in government vehicles who established themselves in the community center and began systematic interviews with residents who'd been present during the events under investigation. Elena watched their professional approach from her apartment window, noting their methodical documentation and careful questioning techniques. Elena's interview was scheduled for the afternoon, giving her time to observe how other community members handled official questioning and adjust her own responses based on the investigators' apparent areas of interest and concern. Anna Moldovan was questioned first, her responses focusing on her role in organizing family evacuations and maintaining communication with defensive positions during the emergency situation. Her teaching experience served her well, allowing her to provide clear, factual information while avoiding operational details that could implicate specific individuals in lethal actions. Stefan's interview concentrated on infrastructure damage and explosive activities, his mechanical expertise making him valuable to investigators who wanted to understand how defensive preparations had been implemented so effectively by civilian personnel with limited military training. Father Dimitri's questioning addressed community coordination and decision-making processes, the investigators clearly interested in understanding how civilian leadership had managed complex defensive operations while maintaining population discipline and morale during genuinely dangerous circumstances. When Elena's turn arrived, she entered the community center where the investigators had established their temporary office with the calm confidence of someone prepared to provide truthful cooperation while protecting information that could endanger community members who trusted her with their safety. The lead investigator was a woman in her 40s with the professional demeanor of someone experienced in conducting sensitive interviews related to security operations. Her colleagues appeared to be specialists in tactical analysis and operational reconstruction, their questions likely to focus on technical aspects of the defensive operations rather than general community coordination. Miss Vasquez, the lead investigator, began consulting files that contained more information about Elena's background than she'd expected official authorities to possess. We understand that you've been residing in Krasny Bor for approximately 3 years, working as an art instructor for local children. Elena confirmed the basic facts while noting that the investigators clearly possessed intelligence about her military background and probably understood that she represented more than simply a civilian art teacher who'd happened to be present. During defensive operations, our investigation concerns events that occurred here during the winter months, specifically related to the disappearance of personnel who were conducting authorized security assessments in this region. The investigator continued, "We're interested in your recollections of any unusual activities or threats to community safety during that period." Elena provided careful responses that acknowledged community defensive preparations while emphasizing the protective rather than aggressive nature of their actions. She described the threat assessment process, evacuation procedures for vulnerable residents, and coordination of defensive positions in terms that presented civilian self-defense rather than military-style operations. The investigators' questions revealed sophisticated understanding of tactical operations and individual capabilities, their interest focusing particularly on marksmanship skills and combat experience that might explain how civilian personnel had successfully eliminated trained military specialists. "Miss Vasquez, your military service record indicates specialized training in civilian protection and individual combat operations," the tactical specialist observed. "Did this background influence the defensive measures implemented by your community during the emergency situation?" Elena recognized the critical question that would determine whether her responses satisfied official requirements or triggered additional investigation that could expose community members to criminal prosecution for their participation in defensive operations. "My military experience helped me understand the threat level we were facing and organize defensive measures that prioritize civilian safety," Elena replied truthfully. "My primary concern was protecting families and children who had no experience with dangerous situations requiring coordinated response to external threats." The questioning continued for 2 hours, covering operational details, casualty assessments, and aftermath procedures with the thoroughness that indicated serious official interest in understanding exactly what had occurred during their defensive operations. Elena maintained consistent responses that emphasized community protection while avoiding details that could implicate specific individuals in lethal actions. When the interview concluded, Elena felt cautiously optimistic that her responses had satisfied official requirements while protecting community members from criminal prosecution. The investigators' approach suggested professional interest in understanding successful civilian defense rather than prosecutorial intent to criminalize protective actions. The investigators spent 3 additional days in Krasny Bor conducting follow-up interviews and examining physical evidence related to the infrastructure damage and defensive preparations that had enabled their successful resistance. Their methodology was thorough but not hostile, suggesting official recognition that civilian self-defense represented legitimate response to unauthorized threats rather than criminal resistance to lawful authority. Father Dimitri's final interview addressed community morale and psychological recovery from traumatic events. The investigators clearly interested in understanding how civilian populations processed participation in lethal combat while maintaining social cohesion and commitment to peaceful existence. The priest's responses emphasized spiritual counseling and community support that had helped residents integrate their defensive actions with their values and commitment to peaceful coexistence. His perspective provided officials with understanding of how ordinary people could participate in necessary violence while preserving their essential character and moral framework. On their final day in the village, the investigators conducted a group meeting with community leadership to summarize their findings and provide official assessment of the events under investigation. Elena joined the other leaders in the community center, uncertain whether their collective responses had satisfied official requirements or triggered additional scrutiny. The lead investigator's summary was more positive than Elena had dared hope, acknowledging community defensive actions as legitimate response to unauthorized threats, while recognizing individual capabilities that had enabled successful resistance against superior numbers and equipment. Our investigation concludes that residents of Krasny Bor took appropriate defensive measures when faced with threats from unauthorized personnel conducting illegal operations in civilian areas, the investigator announced. Individual actions were coordinated through legitimate community leadership for protective purposes rather than aggressive resistance to lawful authority. Elena felt profound relief as the investigator continued, explaining that their findings would result in commendation rather than prosecution for community members who demonstrated courage and capability during genuinely dangerous circumstances. The ministry recognizes that civilian populations have both the right and responsibility to defend themselves when faced with threats that exceed the capacity of official security forces to address, the investigator said. Your community's actions represent exemplary civil defense that protected innocent lives while eliminating threats to regional security. Stefan raised the practical question that concerned everyone present, whether their defensive preparations and community coordination would be subject to ongoing official supervision or restrictions that might limit their ability to maintain security measures. The investigator's response provided reassurance that Elena hadn't expected from official authorities who typically preferred civilian populations to remain dependent on government protection rather than developing independent defensive capabilities. Your community has demonstrated competence and responsibility in managing security threats, the investigator replied. Official policy encouraged such civil preparedness while maintaining coordination with regional authorities for situations that exceed local capabilities. After the investigators departed, Elena gathered with the other community leaders to process the outcome of official scrutiny that could have resulted in criminal prosecution or forced relocation to avoid ongoing supervision and restrictions. Father Dmitri offered a prayer of gratitude for official recognition of their defensive actions, his words acknowledging both divine protection and human courage that had enabled their community to survive threats that could have destroyed their peaceful existence. Elena felt the weight of transition from secret defensive operations to officially acknowledged civil preparedness, recognizing that their community had gained legal recognition for capabilities they'd hoped never to use, but had proven essential for protecting what they valued most. The months that followed brought integration of defensive preparedness with normal community activities, acknowledgement of security responsibilities alongside commitment to peaceful pursuits that had originally drawn Elena to their mountain village. Her art classes continued with students who understood that their teacher possessed capabilities beyond artistic instruction, but who appreciated both aspects of her contribution to their community's safety and cultural development. The children's artwork reflected deeper understanding of peace as something that required protection rather than simply existing without effort or vigilance. Their paintings captured both beauty and strength, expressing appreciation for safety that had been earned through courage rather than simply assumed as natural condition. Elena established advanced classes for older students who showed interest in understanding the relationship between creative expression and personal capability, helping them develop skills that could serve both artistic and practical purposes in an uncertain world. The integration of her dual identity as artist and protector created new possibilities for community education that emphasized both beauty and strength as essential elements of meaningful existence. Stefan expanded his mechanical expertise to include defensive technologies and communication systems, his shop becoming resource center for community preparedness that maintained readiness while supporting normal economic activities. Ana Moldovan incorporated emergency preparedness into educational curriculum, helping children understand safety procedures and community coordination without creating anxiety about potential threats to their peaceful existence. Father Dimitri's Sermons addressed spiritual dimensions of protective responsibility, helping congregation understand courage and defensive action as moral obligations rather than departures from peaceful values. Elena's story became inspiration for community members who discovered capabilities they hadn't known they possessed, proof that ordinary people could rise to extraordinary challenges when circumstances required protection of what they valued most. The woman who'd been underestimated because of her gentle appearance and artistic sensibilities had proven that true strength, developed through integration of seemingly contradictory capabilities, that the most effective guardians were those who understood both creation and protection as essential aspects of meaningful life. Elena continued teaching children to paint landscapes and express themselves through color and form, but she did so with knowledge that she'd successfully protected their right to pursue such peaceful activities when that right had been threatened by forces that would have destroyed their community without hesitation. Her students created artwork that celebrated both beauty and security, their brushstrokes expressing gratitude for teacher who'd shown them that strength could coexist with gentleness, that protection could serve creation rather than opposing it. The mountains surrounding their valley continued providing inspiration for artistic expression and defensive advantages that had enabled successful resistance, their beauty enhanced by knowledge that it had been preserved through courage and capability rather than simple good fortune. Elena looked forward to years of continued teaching and community involvement, knowing that her dual role as artist and protector had been officially recognized and accepted by people who'd learned to value both aspects of her contribution to their shared existence. 2 years had passed since the official investigation concluded with recognition rather than prosecution, and Elena's reputation had quietly spread beyond their mountain village to other remote communities facing similar security challenges. The Romanian Ministry of Internal Affairs had begun consulting her on civilian defense protocols, requesting her expertise in developing training programs that could help isolated populations protect themselves without relying entirely on official security forces that might not be available during critical situations. Elena found herself traveling monthly to the capital, where she worked with government specialists to design educational materials that taught basic defensive concepts through seemingly innocuous community activities, art therapy sessions that incorporated situational awareness training, hiking clubs that developed terrain analysis skills, and photography workshops that enhanced observation capabilities. The programs allowed civilian populations to develop protective competencies while maintaining plausible cover for activities that appeared entirely recreational and cultural. Her dual expertise in artistic instruction and military operations made her uniquely qualified to create training methods that could be implemented in communities without triggering suspicion from hostile elements who might view obvious defensive preparations as threats requiring elimination. The approach balanced effective security, education with operational discretion that protected communities from retaliation by groups who preferred civilian populations to remain helpless and dependent. During one of her consulting trips to Bucharest, Elena was approached by Colonel Andrei Lupescu, a career military officer who specialized in unconventional warfare and civilian resistance operations. His background included extensive experience in training irregular forces and developing defensive strategies for populations that couldn't rely on conventional military protection. Ms. Vasquez, Colonel Lupescu said during their meeting in a secure government facility, "Your work in Krasny Bor has attracted attention from officials who understand the value of civilian populations, capable of defending themselves against threats that exceed the capacity of regular security forces to address effectively." Elena recognized the subtle recruitment approach, the kind of careful inquiry used to determine whether someone with specialized capabilities might be willing to accept broader responsibilities that serve national security interests, while utilizing their unique combination of skills and experience. "Colonel," I found satisfaction in helping communities develop protective capabilities through educational programs that enhance security without compromising peaceful existence. Elena replied diplomatically, "My current work allows me to contribute to civilian safety while maintaining the kind of normal life I've worked to build." Colonel Lupescu smiled with understanding that suggested familiarity with personnel who'd transitioned from active military service to civilian roles but retained capabilities that could serve broader security purposes when circumstances required extraordinary measures. "Miss Vasquez, I'm not proposing return to active military duty or involvement in operations that would compromise your civilian status," the colonel clarified. "Rather, I'm suggesting expansion of your current consulting work to include international programs that could benefit communities throughout Eastern Europe who face similar challenges to those your village encountered." Elena felt the familiar tension between personal desire for peaceful existence and recognition that her capabilities could serve purposes beyond individual satisfaction. The proposal represented opportunity to help other communities develop defensive competencies that could save lives, but it also meant accepting responsibilities that would require ongoing involvement in security matters rather than simple return to artistic instruction. "What kind of international programs?" Elena asked, her curiosity overcoming her instinctive reluctance to expand her involvement in security-related activities beyond the minimum necessary for protecting her adopted community. Colonel Lupescu consulted files that contained information about security challenges facing rural communities throughout the region, civilian populations that were vulnerable to the same kinds of unauthorized military operations that had threatened Elena's village. "There are 17 communities in 4 countries that have requested assistance with civilian defense training," the colonel explained. "All are remote locations with limited access to official security support, populated by families who've experienced or been threatened by unauthorized operations conducted by groups claiming government authority." Elena studied the demographic information and security assessments, noting patterns that were disturbingly similar to the circumstances that had preceded the attack on Krasny Bor. Remote communities with valuable resources or strategic locations, civilian populations with no defensive capabilities, and reports of unauthorized personnel conducting population assessments that typically preceded more aggressive operations. The communities would benefit from training programs similar to those you've developed for our domestic implementation, Colonel Lupescu continued. Art therapy, cultural activities, and recreational programs that incorporate defensive education without obvious military content that might attract attention from hostile elements. Elena realized that accepting the proposal would require her to balance expanded consulting responsibilities with her commitment to teaching art in Krasny Bor, but it would also provide opportunity to prevent other communities from experiencing the kind of violence that had tested her village's survival capabilities. "Colonel, would this expanded work require extended travel or relocation from my current community?" Elena asked, recognizing that her answer would depend partially on whether she could maintain her relationships and responsibilities in the village that had become her true home. The programs would be implemented through periodic consultation visits rather than permanent relocation, Colonel Lupescu replied. "Your base of operations would remain in Krasny Bor, with travel requirements approximately 1 week per month to communities that have requested assistance." Elena considered the proposal while weighing her obligations to students who depended on her artistic instruction against opportunities to help other communities develop capabilities that could protect families from threats they were unprepared to face alone. "I would need community support for expanded travel schedule and coordination with local leadership to ensure my art classes and community responsibilities could continue without interruption," Elena said, indicating willingness to consider the proposal if practical arrangements protected her existing commitments. Colonel Lupescu nodded approvingly, recognizing Elena's priorities and the importance of maintaining her civilian relationships and identity while utilizing her expertise for broader security purposes. Your community leadership has already been consulted and expressed support for expanded consulting work that would bring recognition to Krasny Bor as Center for Innovative Civilian Defense Education, the colonel revealed. Father Dmitry and the others understand the value of sharing successful defensive strategies with communities facing similar challenges. Elena felt both surprise and gratitude that her community had been involved in discussions about her potential expanded role, recognizing their support as evidence of how completely she'd been accepted as permanent member of their extended family, whose contributions extended beyond individual instruction to broader community security and reputation. Returning to Krasny Bor after her meeting in Bucharest, Elena found her community buzzing with excitement about the recognition their defensive innovations had received from government officials who understood the value of civilian populations capable of protecting themselves during emergencies. Anna Moldovan greeted her with enthusiasm that reflected pride in Elena's achievements and appreciation for the positive attention their village was receiving from authorities who'd initially viewed their defensive capabilities with suspicion rather than admiration. Elena, the children have been asking about your meeting with government officials, Anna said with maternal satisfaction. They're proud that their art teacher is being recognized as expert in helping communities stay safe while maintaining peaceful existence. Elena smiled at the children's understanding of her expanded role, appreciating their ability to integrate her dual identity as artist and security specialist without confusion about her primary commitment to their educational and creative development. Stefan approached with practical questions about how Elena's expanded consulting work would affect community preparedness and security training that had become routine aspects of their village operations over the past 2 years. Elena, will your work with other communities provide insights that improve our own defensive capabilities? Stefan asked with the mechanical precision that had made him valuable during their original defensive operations. Elena recognized Stefan's question as reflecting community interest and continuous improvement of their security preparations, acknowledgement that peaceful existence required ongoing vigilance and development of protective capabilities rather than simple reliance on past success. The communities I'll be working with face challenges similar to what we experienced, but each situation has unique characteristics that require adapted solutions, Elena replied. The experience will enhance my understanding of defensive strategies while providing opportunities to test educational methods we've developed here. Father Dmitry joined their conversation with moral perspective that had guided community decision-making throughout their transformation from isolated mountain village to recognized Center for Civilian Defense Innovation. Elena, your expanded work represents opportunity to share gifts that have preserved our communities' peaceful existence while helping other families develop capabilities they need for protection against threats beyond their current experience, the priest observed. Elena felt the weight of expanded responsibility balanced against its satisfaction of knowing her capabilities would serve purposes beyond individual achievement, helping other communities develop defensive competencies that could prevent the kind of violence that had once threatened to destroy everything her adopted family had built together. Her first international consultation took place in a Slovak village that had experienced unauthorized military operations similar to those that had threatened Krasny Bor. The community leadership had requested assistance with defensive preparations after reports of assessment teams conducting systematic population surveys in their region. Elena arrived in Stary Smokovic with teaching materials disguised as art supplies and recreational equipment, her cover story identifying her as cultural. The cover story provided plausible explanation for detailed surveying and mapping activities, but community leadership suspected the real purpose involved intelligence gathering for potential future operations. Elena worked with Hungarian officials to design training programs that enhanced community security. Awareness while maintaining cover stories that appeared entirely consistent with cultural preservation and educational development activities. The Hungarian consultation introduced Elena to coordination challenges that arose when working across language barriers and different cultural approaches to community organization and decision-making processes. Her solutions required adaptation of training methods to accommodate varying leadership structures and communication patterns. Each international consultation expanded Elena's understanding of how civilian defense principles could be adapted to different geographical, cultural, and demographic circumstances while maintaining effectiveness and operational security that protected communities from retaliation by hostile elements. Her reputation grew among government officials and community leaders who recognized the value of civilian populations capable of protecting themselves during situations that exceeded the capacity of official security forces to provide adequate protection. After completing consultations in 6 different communities over 8 months, Elena was invited to address an international conference on civilian preparedness and rural security that brought together officials from 12 countries, facing similar challenges with unauthorized military operations in civilian areas. Elena's presentation focused on integration of cultural activities with defensive education, demonstrating how artistic instruction and recreational programs could develop security capabilities without obvious military content that might trigger hostile attention from groups that preferred civilian populations to remain helpless and unorganized. The conference delegates responded with enthusiasm to Elena's practical approaches and proven success in developing civilian defensive competencies through methods that enhanced community cohesion while building protective capabilities. Following the conference, Elena received consultation requests from officials in Poland, Czech Republic, and Bulgaria who wanted to implement similar programs in communities that had reported unauthorized military activities or unusual personnel conducting suspicious assessment operations. Elena accepted expanded consulting responsibilities while maintaining her primary commitment to art instruction in Krasny Bor, recognizing that her work had evolved into something larger than individual teaching or even single community protection. Her students continued developing artistic skills and creative expression, but they did so with pride in knowing their teacher was recognized internationally as expert in helping communities maintain peaceful existence through capabilities that could protect families when official security forces were unavailable or inadequate. The children's artwork began incorporating themes that reflected their understanding of strength and gentleness as complementary rather than conflicting qualities, their paintings expressing appreciation for teacher who'd shown them that protection could serve creativity rather than opposing it. Elena established advanced workshops for teenagers and young adults who showed interest in understanding defensive concepts through artistic and cultural activities, preparing them to contribute to community security while pursuing creative interests and normal civilian careers. Her expanded work brought recognition to Krasny Bor as innovative center for civilian defense education, attracting positive attention from officials who understood the value of rural communities capable of contributing to national security through local preparedness and protective capabilities. The village received government funding for infrastructure improvements and educational programs that enhanced both quality of life and defensive advantages. Official recognition that civilian preparedness represented valuable contribution to regional security rather than problematic independence from government authority. Elena's art supply store expanded to include materials and equipment that served both creative instruction and practical preparedness, her business becoming resource center for communities throughout the region that wanted to develop similar programs. Stefan's mechanical shop became training facility for technical aspects of civilian defense, his expertise in infrastructure and communication systems helping other communities develop capabilities that enhance security while supporting normal economic activities. Anna Moldovan began conducting educational workshops for teachers from other communities, sharing methods for incorporating preparedness concepts into standard curriculum without creating anxiety or obvious military content that might attract unwanted attention. Father Dimitri's moral guidance helped other religious leaders understand protective responsibility as spiritual obligation rather than departure from peaceful values, his perspective providing framework for communities that struggled to reconcile defensive capabilities with commitment to nonviolent existence. Elena's story became inspiration for civilian populations who discovered that ordinary people could develop extraordinary capabilities when circumstances required protection of what they valued most, proof that strength and gentleness could coexist in service of meaningful existence. The woman who'd been underestimated because of her artistic sensibilities and gentle appearance had created new possibilities for civilian security education that enhanced community preparedness while preserving cultural values and peaceful aspirations. Elena continued teaching children to paint landscapes and express themselves through color and form, but she did so with knowledge that her work had broader impact extending far beyond individual instruction to protection of communities throughout Eastern Europe who faced similar challenges to those her village had overcome. Her students created artwork that celebrated both beauty and security, their brushstrokes expressing gratitude for teacher who'd shown them that true strength developed through integration of seemingly contradictory capabilities rather than choosing between protection and creation. The mountains surrounding their valley continued providing inspiration for artistic expression and defensive advantages that had enabled successful resistance, their beauty enhanced by knowledge that it had been preserved and shared with other communities through courage and capability rather than simple good fortune. Elena looked toward years of continued teaching and international consulting, knowing that her dual role as artist and security specialist had created new standards for civilian defense, education that balanced effectiveness with operational discretion. While serving communities throughout the region, her legacy would be measured not just in artistic instruction or even successful defense of single community, but in transformation of how civilian populations understood their capabilities and responsibilities for protecting peaceful existence in an uncertain world. The gentle art teacher who'd once been dismissed as too sensitive for combat had proven that true warriors were those who understood both creation and protection as essential aspects of meaningful life, using strength to serve beauty rather than opposing it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.